Hey guys, and welcome back to part 2 of making this fabulous, sexy bustier. So in this episode, we will be cutting and sewing the pieces together. Let's go! So first, we are going to lay out our fabric and iron out all the creases. That's what you do with all our relationships. So we do the same with our fabrics. Okay, so after ironing it out, you then take out your pattern pieces and lay them according to the directions you've labeled onto each pattern piece. So the front bodice will be on its fold, and that's why I've put the piece on the fold of the fabric. And you pin them all into place. You don't want to waste a lot of fabric, so you make sure that you put the different pieces right next to each other so that you don't waste a lot of fabric. While cutting out, make sure you also cut the notches. So I only realized that the fabric was a little too heavy for the ruffle, so I decided to use a much lighter fabric. So I started off with sewing together the center front cup and the side cup together using the notches. Remember to backstitch in the beginning and end of sewing. Do the same for the other cup. Afterwards, take one of the cups and make little slices down on the seam allowance in order to accommodate the curved shape. After doing that for both, press open the seam allowance with an iron. So now you repeat the process with the lining. Please note that the self fabric is interfaced and the lining fabric is not interfaced. So for the second fabric, I decided to cut the bodice as 2 pieces instead of 1 on the fold. So I'm going to sew them together to make 1 bodice. Now we're going to repeat the process on the lining fabric. And iron the seam allowances open. Next, you'll be combining the self cup with the lining cup, up faces facing together, and stitch the top edge of the cup. And with the pieces pulled apart, that's how it would look. Then you will edge stitch by placing the seam allowance towards the lining cup, and then sew. You know, I'm trying this new nail polish and it's peeling off, so just please don't mind my nasty nails. Okay, thank you. Then after edge stitching the seam allowance towards the lining, when you fold it backwards, you can tell that it creates a neat finish at the edge. Next, you'll sew together the top edge of the center front of the self and lining bodices. Then from the notched edge of the inner strap, you sew upwards. The cup space should be left open. You will also have to edge stitch the lining of the center front bodice. So to prep the bodice for the cup, you'll have to base stitch the curve of where the cup will fit in up until the notch. Then base stitch the cup on the bottom and then cut out fabric leave outs. Okay guys, so this was a process that I had a whole conversation with my mother, who's also a fashion designer, and you know, this is not how to do it basically, because you're supposed to prep the cup before you can set it in, just like how you would set in a sleeve on a blazer and so forth, right? So I'm going to show you what happens when you do it this way, which is the incorrect way, okay? It's a learning session right now. So here I am just pinning along the cup to the bodice, which is good to use your pins. But in this case, I did not prep the cups. So then after sewing, it came out looking like this, and it had all these plucks and it just looked unneat in general. So the best way is to do this technique that I learned back in college, where you basically manipulate the threads to make it very like small, and then it creates mini gathers that make the cup fold forward or to mold in order to sit in the space, and you'll see a difference. So the first thing you're going to do is set the needle length to 1. Then you take your cup and with your thumb you place your finger behind the foot and press down really hard so that the fabric does not move while you sew. And as you sew, tiny gathers will then develop by your thumb, and you should not pick up your thumb. Once the gathers get super big, you may move your thumb closer, tighten it up again, press down hard, and keep sewing until you get to the other end of your cup. Now you see the result of the manipulation, where the cup is now ready to be set into the bodice in a very smooth way. Okay, then now you use the pins just like before to set in your cup into the bodice. Okay, now you can see a cute difference that with an iron everything can be straightened out, and with comparison to the previous cup there's a lot less plucking. Okay, so after setting in both your cups and steaming and ironing those areas, we are going to add this cute little plastic boning that my mom again hooked me up with, but I'll put the description box below for it, and we're going to put boning along the cup area. So this is how we do it. So first you have to make sure that you have serged or overlocked the ends that you've done, and then we're going to create a casing with the overlocked seam allowance. So knowing that my plastic boning / wiring is around 1/8 to 1/4 inch thick, I used the foot as the measuring or the measurement of how big the casing will be. I then stitched one end closed on each cup. Then slid the plastic wiring through the casing. Then with the remaining plastic wiring, I shifted upwards just a little bit, then cut off the excess wiring, then pushed it down again to acquire the space needed. Okay, next, to prep your ruffles, you will need to take all of them and start sewing them together using 1/2 inch seam allowance. After combining them all together, you then press open the seam allowance. Then you repeat the process with the lining fabric. After combining all the ruffle pieces of both the self fabric and the lining fabrics, you then sandwich them together and sew at 1/4 inch seam allowance. Afterwards, you edge stitch with the seam allowance facing towards the lining. Afterwards, you pull the insides out and press with an iron. Okay, so next we're going to base stitch all around the front bodice. So by placing the bodice onto the mannequin, I just wanted to see the fit, how it's sitting, how the straps are sitting specifically before I attach the ruffles and the back bodice. Since we prepped the ruffles as well, I thought it was a good time to just measure to see if it does cover all the necessary edges of the whole design. So there's a few things I've noticed when just checking the silhouette of the design in general. I was hoping that there is enough space for the back bodice, as well as I've noticed that it flops. Like, it's not as stern as I thought it was. I do advise that if you do want it as stern as the picture, you use a harder interfacing, as well as layer a second ruffle underneath, like the video I saw on Instagram. But yeah, I just decided to leave it to flop down because, I was just interested to see how it would look on the body before I tack it up. See, it kind of does wake it up a little bit after I've put pins. Moving on, before I sew the back bodice onto the front bodice, I first measure to see where does the straps end, and I just put little notches on each end to indicate the position of the straps. Okay, so what you're going to do first is take the self bodice and attach the strap to the notches you've just made. Sew the straps at 1/2 inch seam allowance. Then take the lining fabric and sandwich the strap in between at 1/2 inch seam allowance. Afterwards, edge stitch on the lining fabric with the seam allowance facing the lining in order to create a neat finish. Afterwards, base stitch the bottom end of the bodice panel. To attach the ruffle onto the bodice, you'll have to get the midpoint of the ruffle and then attach it to the center front point of the bodice. Starting from the midpoint, you sew to one end. Then when you reach the corner, you first put in your needle, then you pick up the foot, then you rotate the bodice and the ruffle in position, and then you put down the foot again to continue sewing. Now when you reach the bodice section, you then leave a space on the ruffle for that section and then start at the edge of the bodice with the ruffle and continue stitching using the rotation technique. If you're having difficulties rotating the ruffle, just notch a few ends in order to create that manipulation. So with the half made bodice, this is how it would look with a little hole right by the bodice area that we left open. Then you start again onto the midpoint again to sew the other half of the ruffle. So at the end of a ruffle, you'll have to put the ends inwards. And how you're going to do that is by putting the end inside out to sew down. Make sure to cut off the corner before turning it inside out. Then it's going to leave a little space to turn the ruffle like in and out again, and then you can edge stitch to close off the remaining hole. So when we're closing the little hole that we left on the back bodice, we're going to edge stitch, and how you do so is that after overlocking all your ends, you then put some safety pins to put them in place so that you may edge stitch neatly. So now when sewing the bodices together, the front and back bodice together, you'll need to use a pin to indicate where the positioning of the back bodice would be. Plus there's a ton of ruffles everywhere, so you kind of need to see things clearly. You'll take the one end of the bodice, pin it into place, and sew it together. Okay, after sewing the bodices together, this is how it will look on the side, with a little gap in between to make a unique crop top look. But we need to finish the ends by hemming it upwards. When hemming, just make sure that the side seams are open apart, and when sewing, you start right at the one end of the ruffle, going across with the side seam allowances open, and make sure you backstitch at the beginning and at the end to create this finished look. Next, you need to get a zip that can detach at the end. I only had this length and color, so I just decided to use it. So facing the zip upside down with the detachable part at the hem, I sewed it with a zipper foot and done the same thing on the other side. And when cutting it shorter, you pull back the zip and then cut the excess zip. Leave enough space so that you can fold the zip within the seam allowance. Pin the excess zip into place. Right side up, this is how you pin the excess zip into place. Afterwards, you then top stitch. And this is how the final closure should look. And this is how it looks on, a very fun, flirty, kind of ruffled up bustier. It did not come up as stern as the example picture, but I kind of like the relaxed feel. It gives it a more casual look that I can wear in a normal Sunday brunch. And it's a crop top, so it's cute. So if you enjoyed this video, please subscribe for more. Thank you for watching, and also you can get the PDF pattern from my Etsy store called Chantal Goals Patterns. Link available in the description box below. Till next post, toodles!